Those images, Jessica Le Masurier in the newsroom. It is time for the debate. The Syrian regime is crowing, the West and Turkey brooding, while others like Lebanon are keeping a low profile. We're of course talking about Russia and China's veto of what would have been the first legally binding Security Council resolution against Bashar al-Assad's regime since the start of the pro-democracy uprising there back in March. We're going to be looking at the reasons behind that veto and the next move of the main players on the outside looking in on a brutal crackdown. Note, by the way, the Syrian opposition itself divided over how far outside intervention should go. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the fallout from the veto on sanctions. And with us, Samir Aita, editor of the Arab language edition of Le Monde Diplomatique.
Hello.
How are you, Samir?
Fine.
Also with us in the Romanian capital, Suat Kiniklioglu, a senior leader of Turkey's ruling AK party. Suat, what brings you to beautiful Bucharest? All right, we'll try to get through to Suat in a moment, still linking up there. In Beirut, Michael Young, opinion editor for the Daily Star newspaper, author of The Ghosts of Martyrs Square. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Could I ask your technical people to raise the volume, if you don't mind?
All right. The request forwarded as such. Thank Michael Young. Hopefully, could we raise the volume, please, for Michael in Beirut? And also with us from Washington, Bilal Saab. He's a fellow at the Monterey Institute of International Studies, keenly watching the developments, the diplomatic flurry that we've seen out of New York over the past 24 hours. Thanks for being with us. We also want to thank the viewers for weighing in on the conversation on the France 24 Debate Facebook page and on Twitter, where our handle is @FrancoisF24. Now, before we look at that flurry of diplomacy, let's first look at the realities. With, for instance, this disturbing amateur video footage reportedly from last Thursday and Friday in the central town of Rastan, where tanks and helicopters backed an assault that, according to the opposition, killed 27. In that context, the chair of the brand new Syrian National Council, formed over the weekend in Istanbul, reacted earlier to that Russian and Chinese veto. He said, supporting Bashar al-Assad in his militarist and fascist project will not encourage the Syrian people to stick to a peaceful revolution. Samir Aita, do you agree that one of the fallouts of the fact that, well, the UN is to a certain degree perhaps disenfranchised after that vote is going to encourage a full-blown civil war?
This is the major issue in what's happening in Syria. Of course, the people are demonstrating. There is a civil soulèvement, uprising in Syria, and it is very courageous. It is very sticky on showing that it has the will to overthrow the regime, but it is weakened. It has been all the first, second-rank leaders, the young leaders, has been arrested, maybe 80,000 beside the killed.
80,000?
80,000 beside the killed. And they have classes where they have people arrested, and the people are really... some of the people are defending themselves, taking arms.
More and more.
More and more. Some of them are pushed by foreign forces or foreign to take such arms. And this is a very dangerous perspective.
Which foreign forces?
I don't know, but I think there is a lot. Syria, with its position, has a lot of enemies. And if you look at all, let's say, foreign forces, the regional forces and the big powers, if I have an advice, please separate the local issue, the internal issue, means the uprising against the regime to topple it, and the change of, let's say, the direction of Syria and its alliances regionally and in the world. If you play the two games together, this will make the country explode. Leave it as it is for the regional balances, because on the regional balances you will have different things. You have Lebanon, Iraq, Turkey, and many other things in the region. Now the problem is you have a regime who, from the beginning, did not want to see and recognize that there is an uprising and there is an opposition who want them to change. In the beginning, they didn't want to change the president. Now everybody, including the silent majority, says that the president has to go. Finish. The question is how to go. If you mix the regional policies in this, the situation will be more and more complex. See the resolution of the Security Council.
We're going to get back to that point, whether or not more sanctions and an outside intervention are what's needed. First, though, let's just point out, the West may be furious about the veto of that measure in the Security Council, of a measure which, by the way, it was in his 5th draft, didn't even include the word sanctions. Not everyone, though, as you're about to hear, was miffed.
This is a historic day that Russia and China as nations are standing for the people and against injustices. And I feel that the future is Russia and China and the East. That is the future.
Michael Young, do you agree with that spokeswoman for Bashar al-Assad that Damascus can safely put its eggs in the basket of Russia and China?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think that was Buthaina Sha'ban. I can't see, but
it was.
If she sees Russia and China as the future, perhaps China, but I don't think Syria is the future. At least the regime of Bashar al-Assad. I think that I think we have to understand that this decision at the Security Council was probably taken in the context of it's a complex time at the Security Council over a number of decisions. The fact that the Russians and the Chinese vetoed this now doesn't mean that in the future, negotiations over a future resolution. But the fact of the matter is that today what's going to change events in Syria is not what happens in New York, it's what happens in Syria. And to a certain extent, I can sympathize with what Samir Aita was saying. At the end, you have internal dynamics, and these internal dynamics are what is threatening the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The Chinese and the Russians, I think, have made a mistake, because if you want to calculate down the road, there will be, I think, a reckoning for this decision with the Syrian people. But at the same time, I don't think that this is the end of the game at the UN, nor do I necessarily believe that those actors at the United Nations are those who will define the future of Syria. Let's be very honest. I mean, in as much as I'm pleased to see many of these countries, especially the United States, taking an interest in Syria, the fact of the matter is that it took many, many months for the Obama administration to do anything useful on Syria. And today, for the American ambassador, Susan Rice, to express outrage with the Russians and the Chinese, while I share that outrage. But for a long time, I must confess that I also had a great deal of outrage, or felt outrage, for the absence of any policy in the international community and the Arab world over Syria. And we are paying the price for this absence, for this long absence of any kind of diplomatic initiatives that took place during these long months of carnage.
All right, interesting. So playing catch up there, and you mentioned how outside factors may have played. First of all, let's listen to Russia's ambassador to the United Nations. He says, in effect, Moscow believes in evolution, not revolution.
To claim, as another colleague did, that our veto was against the Arab Spring, well, it's a cute little phrase, but not a very serious one, because we, of course, do not see the Arab Spring as something which should lead to civil war. And this is where, in our view, things are going in Syria. And that's why we did not want to be a part of a strategy which, for whatever reason, in our view, is leading in that direction.
Now, the correspondent for French newspaper Le Monde quotes a UN source as saying that hours before the vote, that ambassador hinted at abstention before being called to order by Moscow. Bilal Saab, what's your reading of what happened in New York?
Well, first of all, I'm in full agreement with what my friend Michael Yang said regarding the internal dynamics and how these are ultimately the major determinant of Syria's future. But, you know, on the one point, it's a little bit unsurprising what the Russian and Chinese positions were, but there's also an element of surprise in them. They're unsurprising because the Syrian government has important military and commercial relations with the Chinese and the Russians. As we know, Syria is a major importer of arms from Moscow. But at the same time, it's surprising because it's short-sighted. If I were a Russian official, I'm betting on the Syrian people and not on the Syrian regime, simply because the Syrian regime is a sinking ship. And we certainly don't know when it's going to collapse, but I believe it's unsustainable. And for them to side with the regime, which is really in dire straits right now, tells me that the position of the Russians is really short-sighted.
But you heard there Michael Young
build bridges with the Syrian people.
You heard there Michael Young say.
I'm sorry. You want to build bridges with the Syrian people. You don't want to burn bridges with the Syrian people, especially that it's possible that this regime is likely to collapse sometime soon.
You heard Bilal Saab. You heard Michael Young there a moment ago say some of the factors may be external. Do you think a lot of this had to do with basically anger over the way the UN resolution over Libya went down?
Well, they're certainly uncomfortable with how sanctions all of a sudden escalated to military intervention in Libya. And they don't want to set a precedent for that in terms of massive human rights violations, because their own internal situations, whether it's in the Tibet with the Chinese or it's in Chechnya with the Russians, they're having similar situations. They do not want to invite external intervention because they're very uncomfortable with the ethnic minorities, and whether it's in the Tibet, whether it's in Chechnya. So what happens in Syria is sort of connected in the Russian and the Chinese view.
All right, it was a 9-2 vote, just to remind everyone. The two against were obviously China and Russia. Should note there were some important abstentions. I want to mention three of them: Brazil, India, South Africa. Among those abstaining, in effect saying that the UN didn't protect civilians as promised in Libya. Suat Kiniglioglu, I know that your prime minister has said that your country is going to press forth with sanctions. What do you think of that, those so-called BRICS countries abstaining?
Well, it's a little bit surprising and a little bit disappointing at the same time. I agree with the former speakers that the regime in Syria is not sustainable, and I think given the example of what happened in Libya, I think it was not very smart on either the Chinese or the Russian side or the BRICS side, actually, to take the position that they've taken. But those are, of course, individual countries taking positions on these issues, and I agree that the story is not over yet at the UN, that there could be a new resolution, a new wording, and maybe a new coalition of countries bringing this again to the Council. But what matters here really is, I mean, as you said, Prime Minister Erdogan has, as he is visiting currently South Africa, said actually in South Africa that Turkey cannot stand by when Syrian citizens are being killed as neighbors. And Turkey will certainly announce sanctions against Syria on the 9th of October, when Prime Minister Erdogan is scheduled to visit the border region of Syria.
And how is South Africa, how are his hosts reacting? We know that South Africa dragged its feet over Libya and, again, abstaining at the UN over Syria.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's, as I said, those are individual countries' positions, and it's, you know, I mean, I wish they would not have taken these positions, but I think those who, you know, the group of countries who are calling for change, who are calling for more democracy, and for the legitimate demands of the Syrian people to be met will, in the end, prevail. And I hope that the countries who've chosen to abstain or to veto will actually come to terms with it. Hopefully will change course over the coming weeks and months.
Samir Aita.
I think two issues should be mentioned. First, it's not really exact to say that that Russia and China are supporting Syria because there is a lot of arms deal between Syria and these two countries. This is not true, because the Americans, whenever there is any armed deal, even with Russia, has forbidden Syria from taking this, and most of the equipment are old. beside this, the interest of Russia is that it has a military naval basis in Tartus on the Mediterranean, which is the last military basis of the Russians in the Mediterranean Sea. And if you look at the bigger picture, this is the second remark, and which explains the position of Russia, China, but also the BRIC country, except Turkey. We'll get back to Turkey. This is the last country in the Middle East, in the Arab region, which is not pro-Western. It has its policies, it makes alliances, sometimes with Iran, sometimes with Russia, sometimes with the French, depending on how to maneuver, whatever is the policy. If this country fall, the whole Middle East will be pro-US. And this is some other people see it as a danger, which means the Americans will control the oil, the Middle East, and etc. And this dimension exists. This is why I asked for separation of the two fights.
Bilal Saab, on that point, one of the other differences is that when the sanctions against Libya were voted on, we didn't yet know that Vladimir Putin had thrown his hat in the ring to return as president. Has that made a big difference, you think?
I'm sorry, could you ask me a question again? I couldn't really hear you. The volume is a little bit low.
I was saying that before when the UN voted on sanctions against Libya, at the time, Vladimir Putin had not yet announced that he was going to be running for president again.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a big difference?
And I'm sorry, and your question is? Is that a big difference given the fact that Vladimir Putin right now is considering running for presidency?
Not considering, he says he will.
He said he will. Well, look, the domestic consideration is obviously there, but it's more of an issue of national interest at this point. And I do agree with the former speaker that the Russians do have an important naval presence in Tartus, perhaps the only one in the Middle East that the Russians have outside former Soviet space. But at this, again, I want to reiterate the point I mentioned before, which is that it's rather surprising to me and somewhat puzzling that the Russians have chosen to side with a regime that really is no longer sustainable. The fact that the regime is in really dire straits, and it's only a matter of time before new leaders come to fore in Damascus, tells me that the Russians really are short-sighted on this point. There is certainly the domestic consideration, obviously, of Putin, but I don't think it really is more important than the issue of national interest, which is, in my mind now, not really well-defined.
All right, when we come back, we're going to look at whether sanctions are indeed the way forward. Stay with us. The France 24 debate continues.